Hello, I hope you all can hear me. Welcome to another lecture in the Schwenkfelder-Brown Bag lecture series. Today, I'm going to present on a topic I've called German Adventurers in the New World. This is actually based on a textbook I wrote in about 1998, 1999 for a course that I taught on German American cultural heritage at Youngstown State University. So while learning about German immigration history, keep in mind that the word German refers to German-speaking immigrants. Before the 20th century, Germany did not exist as the united country we know today. German immigration history includes not only Germans, but Austrians, Swiss, Russian Germans, and other small groups, including the Schwenkfelders. Over several decades, German immigrants brought along many aspects of their culture and daily life to North America. Some of these customs have become a part of mainstream American culture. Most Germans do not realize that the many ways that German immigrants and their descendants contributed to German American culture. So Germans in the New World is restricted to the time before the German families who wanted to settle in North America came with the Concord to Philadelphia in October of 1683. Around 1440, a German by the name of Johannes Gutenberg invented printing with movable type. This revolution in communication became extremely important in telling the story of the New World throughout Europe. During the 50 years, from then to Columbus's voyage, German printers quickly spread print shops with the new technology, not only in Germany, but also in Italy, Spain, and Portugal. Columbus's report of his discovery of the New World in a Latin letter, which was printed immediately in several cities. The first German language version of Columbus's letter was printed in Strasbourg in 1497. In addition to printers, German map makers were very much interested in Columbus's discoveries and immediately drew new maps. Among those map makers was Martin Waldseemüller. Using data from Amerigo Vespucci, that Amerigo Vespucci had gathered during voyages from 1501 to 1502 to the New World, Waldseemüller christened the new lands in honor of Vespucci as America on his new map in 1507. We're not sure when Seemüller was born, but he died in 1520. The important map that he made was done in 1507. It consisted of 12 sheets of paper and measured 4.5 by 8 feet. It's believed that there may have been as many as 1,000 copies of this map printed. Amerigo Vespucci died in 1512, and so that was not too long after the map was printed. The Smithsonian Institute acquired a copy of this map in 2003. Here you see the map. At this point, you can see the tip of Africa a little elephant right there. And you can go northward up into this area of Europe. Right across then are the islands that Columbus found. And this map shows, first of all, South America, this strip right here, going all the way up to this tip. And then this is North America. You see how narrow North America is, even more so than South America. A man by the name of Joachim Valdanius also published maps, and his book was Epitoma Topographia Totius Orbis, printed in 1535. It was a rather small book, 3 3/4 inches by about 6 inches, consisting of 230 pages with an appendix of 12 maps. And this book that I'm showing you comes from our own collection here at the Schwenkfelder Heritage. Here you have his perspective of the world. And again, you see Africa here, and up here is Europe. Here are the islands we talked about. You can see that this part is South America, coming up to about here, and then we have North America. This man also included a drawing of Europe, and he puts, of course, Germania right here in the middle of the map. Up here, we have Oceanus Germanicus and a boat, which is a very typical type of drawing for these maps. And some of the places on this map you know pretty well. Here's Silesia right here. And we have this town of Argentiana, which we call today Strasbourg, where the map, the letter of Columbus was printed. Tyrker is the name of the first person we think was German and went to Vinland or Newfoundland around the year 1000. So Columbus's discovery of the New World in 1492 led to the exploration, exploitation, and a lasting settlement of the Americas. But Columbus was not really the first European to reach the Americas. Old Norse Icelandic sagas record the exploits of several Vikings who either sighted or landed on North American continent 400 to 500 years before Columbus's voyage. In the North Saga of the Greenlanders, Leif Erikson's exploration of Vinland around 1000 AD, a man by the name of Tyrker is portrayed as an older servant. In a dialogue with Leif Erikson, Tyrker was said to have spoken German, possibly the first German to set foot in the New World. So let me read the portion of the saga that deals with this early German. Tyrker was missing from their post. Leif was most upset by this, as Tyrker had spent many years with him and his father. Leif prepared to go search for Tyrker, but they had gone only a short distance from the houses when Tyrker came towards them. Leif soon realized that the companion of his childhood was pleased about something. Leif asked him, quote, "Why are you so late returning? And how did you get separated from the rest?" Unquote. For a long time, Türker only spoke in German, with his eyes darting in all directions and his face contorted. They understood nothing of what he was saying. After a while, he spoke in Norse. Quote, I had gone only a bit further than the rest of you, but I have news to tell you. I found grapevines and grapes. Unquote. Quote, are you sure of this? Leif said. I'm absolutely sure, he replied, because where I was born, there was no lack of grapevines and grapes. Now let's come to the earliest Germans in Spanish America. As far as we can tell, the Germans were among the earliest explorers of the New World. Most of these Germans came as participants in Spanish or Portuguese expeditions. Two prominent German financial dynasties, the Fuggers and the Walsers, financed most of the Spanish expeditions during the first half of the 16th century. So let's take a look at these two families, the Fuggers and the Wesslers, whom we might call today venture capitalists. Here's some information about them. Interestingly enough, these two families, the Jakob Fuggers, was about a generation older than the Welser, Anthony Welser. Interestingly, both come from the town of Augsburg. And Jakob Fugger was once called the richest man in history. So let me explain a little bit about how the Fuggers and the Welsers got involved in this. In keeping with the tradition, Charles V was elected Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire by paying off the electoral princes. In order to pay these bribes, Charles borrowed heavily from the Fuggers and the Welsers. The only way Charles V could pay back the debt was to grant those families territories and mineral rights in South America. The Welsers received territory in modern Venezuela, and the Fuggers held land in much of present-day Peru and Chile. To protect their interests, both Fuggers and Welsers sent agents, including family members, to those territories. And I might add that they also sent armies. The Fuggers were mostly unsuccessful in trying to exploit their lands. The Welsers were significantly more successful, but in the end, their exploits ended in disaster. Let's talk about the people who actually went to South America. In general, they were Germans in expeditionary forces of Spain and Portugal. A couple of men returned to Germany and published books about their adventures in the New World. So we're going to take a look at these two men at this time. The first one is Ulrich Schmidl. And here in giving the dates, the 1509 to 1567 are their birth and death dates. And then this other date, 1534 to 1555, is the time they spent in South America. And here we have the title page from the first book. This is the second edition in 1602. A title translated into English is True Stories of an Unimaginable Voyage. It was published originally in Frankfurt, Germany in 1567. And Schmidl recorded his observations and adventures in South America. I think it was probably the illustrations in this book which led to its great popularity. Schmidl sailed in a Spanish fleet from Seville, Spain, to its destination, the Rio de la Plata, present-day Argentina, early in 1535. After a voyage of some 4 months, which is quite a long time, actually, after staying in South America for nearly 20 years, Schmidl returned to Germany in 1554. Here is another portrait of the man with his coat of arms. Schmidl was an agent for the Westlers looking after their interests as he traveled in a Spanish fleet to Argentina. He was hired as a part-time gunner on one of the boats. He mentioned in his narrative that the Westlers had their own ship in the fleet and was carrying some 80 Germans. Schmidl tells of his adventures with the natives, the hardships of exploring the vast area, the battles with the native warriors, and intrigues among soldiers and officers. Here's one of the illustrations from his book, and as I look at this, I think of many illustrations in early German books about military battles in Germany. What I think you really need to remember is that the person who did this woodcut was never in South America and only can work with his imagination and his knowledge of what battles were like in Europe. You see the town here, the native town surrounded by palisades, and you see the native forces here, the Europeans here. Here's another woodcut. Again, we can see the palisades surrounding the town. This is the tribe known as the Carios. And what we see here mainly are the animals that were encountered while in South America. You also see the natives in their dress. Going on to the other writer, we have Hans Staden, who was in the New World for quite some time, 1545 to 1551. And his book is entitled in English, A True Story, History and Description of the Country. It's published in Marburg, Germany around 1557. And he tells the stories of his 2 voyages to South America between 1547 and 1555. The book is divided into 2 parts. The first part of the book is really divided into 2 books. And the first part of the first book tells of his quick voyage to Brazil and the return to Europe in 1548. And the rest of the first part deals with the second voyage, especially his captivity among the Tupinambi for more than a year. Here again, we have the title page of the book. In English, the title, A True History and Description of a Country. Well, it goes on. This is the rest of the title, typical of books printed at that time because they were also advertisements that could be hung up in the printer's window. So at the bottom here, we have a woodcut, which is very, very interesting in the sense that, first of all, we see here on this side a native sitting, reclining in a hammock. And this was the first time that Europeans became acquainted with hammocks. They had never heard of them. So that was something quite new and different coming from South America. And he also talks in his book about these hammocks and the fact that they normally had a little fire under the hammock. I'm not sure exactly what the purpose of the fire was, But you can see that right here in the illustration. The other part of this is a grill with a fire under the grill, and on it you see legs and members of a human body. These people were also known as cannibals. This was quite amazing, interesting to the Europeans. So Staden wrote, "My first journey to America was made in a Portuguese ship. The captain's name was Pinhado. There were 3 of us Germans on board. One came from Bremen and was called Heinrich Braun, and the second was called Heinrich von Bruchhausen. I was the third. My next voyage was from Seville to Rio de Plata. There were no other Germans on board. After much tribulation, anxiety, and danger by land and sea during this one voyage, which endured for 2 years, we suffered shipwreck upon the island of St. Vincent, which lies near the mainland of Brazil, inhabited by the Portuguese." And it's probably quite clear that the Portuguese and the Spanish were much at odds over who was claiming what parts of South America at that time. So you can see that we know Staden had some education. He was especially trained as a gunner, and did most of his training in Lisbon, Portugal. That's probably why his first voyage departed from Portugal. There is a translation of Hans Staden's book. The copy I have was done in 1928. I don't know if there's been a more modern translation since then. And what kind of amazed me was the fact that there was a Brazilian movie made of this person and his life on or in South America. I have several illustrations from this book. I think they're quite fascinating. Again, the woodcutter had his own imagination and whatever Staden happened to tell him. So we see again palisades around these long houses. Here's 3 poles with human skulls at the top. And here we have, according to this description, nothing but women, and Hans here, Hans Staden, right in the middle of the picture. You see the women pulling him into this area. He is in captivity. His hands are tied. It appears that the woman is pulling him by his beard. Here we have, again, the palisades, the huts, poles with human skulls on them. And the tribes were known as cannibals. They only did these on certain occasions, festive occasions, and only to war prisoners. This man right here is said to be the son of the chief, and he wears this particular costume, ostrich feathers, for festive occasions and in battle. Here we have Hans again with his legs and his feet tied, and the son was taunting him, teasing him, and says, "Well, here comes our food hopping toward us." Here we have again Hans Staden in the middle of the page here. He's saying a prayer, hoping for rescue from the danger and bringing peace to him. We see the palisades and the huts and the skulls. But what is interesting here, the other men in this picture are chiefs. And obviously this is at night. We see the stars and the moon. And interesting to the Europeans is the fact that these chiefs here are smoking, and you can see the smoke here from whatever, whether they have pipes or just how they're smoking, I'm unsure. Over here, we have another scene, palisades, skulls, and a cross here. Hans Staden had made a cross out of reeds, erected it, and told the natives not to disturb it or destroy it, but otherwise there would be some sort of misfortune occur to them. So Staden is very uncertain all during this time period, because he knew that they were taunting him about having him as a meal, but when this would occur, they never gave him any idea. This comes from the second part of the book, where Hans Staden talks about the flora, the fauna, festivities, clothing, food, customs, and so on. And this illustration right here was to show how they would fish. Basically, two ways. One was nets, and I think that's being illustrated here. And then shooting bows, arrows, is how they really did their fishing. And here the last illustration is the scene of the cannibalism, the dismemberment of the body, the grill and the fire, and all the women preparing the feast. Let's talk for a moment about the Germans in Mexico. There was Mexico was finally captured and taken command of around 1523, and a lot of artisans, skilled artisans, and workers from German-speaking areas in Europe traveled to Mexico after that conquest of the country, because the economy there was booming and employment opportunities enticed many Germans to immigrate to Mexico. So some Germans, especially those skilled in mining, were hired to establish mines in the mining industry. After their mission was accomplished, they returned to Europe. Here's an interesting family. A man by the name of Jakob Kronberger, born in Germany, trained in the printing trade in Germany, set up print shops in Spain. This is his son, Juan Kronberger, and then a employee of Juan was Giovanni Paroli, a good Italian, but he used the name Juan Pablos when in Spanish-speaking countries. So some of the most important books about the New World were printed by Juan Kronberger, who secured the privilege for printing in Mexico and sent over Juan Pablos, who arrived in Mexico City in 1539 and set up a press there that would become known as the Casa de Juan Kronberger. Between Pablos' arrival and his death in 1561, he published some 37 titles, took over full ownership of the press after Kronberger's death in 1540, and only some of the titles printed survived to the present day. Here is the title page from his first publication. Actually, this is the second edition. a short compendium of, or summary of Catholic doctrine in both Nahuatl and Spanish. Thus, I find very, very interesting. So they were printing Nahuatl language, the native language there in the Mexican area, along with Spanish parts of this book. The indigenous languages, histories, and customs also became more widely studied and read. Then a bilingual dictionary, here the first dictionary of any kind to be published in the New World, was released in 1555. This happens to be an edition of 1571, but it's called a Vocabulario en Lengua Mexicana y Castellana. So this is a vocabulario that is what we would call a dictionary in the Mexican and Castilian or Spanish language. The Inquisition in Mexico. This is important here for Germans in America. As you know, Luther's theses were published in 1517. Charles V was the Holy Roman Emperor. He was also the King of Spain at the same time, and Archduke of Austria. So he reigned over quite a bit of territory. And so there was an idea that being German was the same as being Protestant, namely an enemy of the church. Of course, all of these Spanish and Portuguese explorers and conquistadors were Catholic. And so the idea then was that if you were German, a German speaker, then obviously you were Protestant and you were an enemy of the church, the Catholic Church. So most Germans were brought before the Inquisition. The trial records are very informative about life among the Germans in Mexico. Usually they were found guilty of being an enemy. They were fined, they were imprisoned, and a few were even executed. But the result of this Inquisition was the fact that there were no German speakers in Mexico or any other Spanish colony after 1600. Let's talk a moment about German Jesuits. The Jesuits had a mission. The Jesuits, of course, were made up of many nationalities, and some were German speakers. But the Jesuits went to the Spanish Americas to befriend the native people and convert them to Christianity. They established communities for the natives all over Spanish America, which were called reducciones. These were closed communities. Only Jesuits could live in those or even enter those communities. And the native peoples lived in those communities with the Jesuits. The native peoples were taught reading and writing in their own language, growing crops and raising livestock, as well as a variety of trades and crafts. And this mission lasted from roughly 1588 to 1767. Let's look now at some of the German Jesuits. We don't know exactly how many there were, but a few had a notoriety. The first one was maybe Andreas Feldmann, who arrived there in 1604. Then Anton Sept taught the natives in his reduction to build and play a variety of musical instruments. and their instruments were often used in churches. Some of them, they built all kinds of instruments, but some of them were organs. Florian Pauca was among the last of the Jesuits in South America. He wrote an encyclopedic work of more than 1,000 pages, which he illustrated himself with hundreds of watercolors. Eusebio Francisco Quino had founded a number of missions in Primera Alto region, which is divided now between the Mexican state of Sonora and the US state of Arizona. Now we're moving on to the earliest Germans in North America prior to 1683. 1683 is the date of the arrival of German families in Philadelphia with the intention that they would be settling there for the rest of their life. So the earliest Germans in South America came under the auspices of the Spanish. The earliest Germans in North America were participants in expeditions led by French, Dutch, or English forces. I included Port Royal, although this is very tenuous. This location was in South Carolina and settled in 1562 by a group of Huguenots under the leadership of Jean Ribault. It's claimed that there were German-speaking Alsatians and Hessian Protestants in the group, but there's no real clear evidence of that. Even the evidence for Tüker in Vinland is much more clear than for this group. Jamestown is probably a story you are well acquainted with. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. So it's likely that the first Germans in North America arrived with John Smith on the Mary and Margaret in October 1608. The Germans were glassmakers and carpenters. The 5 glassmakers remained unnamed, but the 3 carpenters were called Adam, Samuel, and Franz. Another voyage to the outpost in 1620 brought 2 unnamed German mineral, that is mining specialists, and 4 unnamed sawmill rights. Let's talk about the German glassmakers first. These glassmakers first built a temporary factory to make glass as sort of a trial to see how feasible that project might be. The carpenters, we're told, went immediately to work producing clapboard and wainscot. Again, something they would certainly not use in Jamestown on the island. That was strictly to be shipped back to England. What you need to know is that at this point in time in England, all the industry that's rising needed fuel to run the factories, to make glass and other products. And this was such a phenomenal boom that firewood in in England became extremely scarce. All the wood, the forests were being cut down. People talk about the bare land for miles and miles where all the forests have been cleared to make fuel for homes and factories. So that's one of the reasons why the English were coming to the New World. They were looking for sources of fuel as well as other things. Their initial experimenting with glass was done inside the fort in temporary quarters. The glassmakers first built a glass house for their experimentations with probably the help of the carpenters. They produced a green glass and put that into ingots to send back on the boat to England, so it could be analyzed to see if that's what they really wanted to do, if that was good enough for the glass that they needed. So roughly 60 out of the 500 inhabitants died from sickness and starvation. I think that story is probably well known. Then the carpenters and the natives, and Smith and Powhatan. This is a very complicated story. I can't begin to tell you everything that happened here. But the carpenters were more or less caught in the middle between Smith and Powhatan. Smith wanted to capture Powhatan and sort of tricked him into the promise of having a house built by the carpenters for Powhatan. And Smith thought he would be able to then trap him in this house. Well, there are many different skirmishes and intrigues about dealing with the native peoples there, that it's a very complicated story. Here is a sample of the green glass sent back to England. This was made especially for a souvenir at the 300th anniversary, I believe it was. They're somewhat rare now, but you still can find them at various antique shows. Let's talk for a moment about the sawmill rights that came later in 1620. Now they're starting to talk about planks needed for houses and the ships that they need there as the town of Jamesville expanded. I would have thought they'd needed the planks much, much earlier, especially as the cold winter set in. But anyway, so and new settlements in the areas were beginning. The problem with the sawmill rights is that there are no swift streams could be found with enough power to run the saws. As you can imagine, they want large planks for building houses and building boats. This is no small feat in creating the power that it would take to run the saws to cut the planks. So it really didn't work out. This is tidewater land. In other words, it's very flat, and about the only movement of water you get is the tide coming in and going out, and it just doesn't produce the power necessary. The reason they could get the power if they would go inland, and that was their goal eventually. But the natives kept fighting them and keeping them out of the Piedmont area, so they never got to where there were swift streams. And eventually the small mill rights died from disease and famine. And the famine was again mainly because they didn't have proper ground for farming. That was in the area that the natives were protecting. Then another group that was there were mineral specialists. These men too wanted to see what sort of minerals and might be found in the area once you get out of the tidewater range. And so German mineral specialists were brought in. And finally, they were able to do some iron forging when they made a little incursion into the territory held by the natives. But eventually there was a massacre of the settlers by the natives in March of 1622. And that, that wiped out the mining and iron production. Now we're going to move a little further north. I can go over these stories rather quickly because you're probably aware of them from your grade school days. We're going to talk about Peter Minuit. He was here twice. He's noted especially about his first visit when he acquired the land of Manhattan from the native Lenapes. And supposedly that's about 11,000 morgans was the measurement given, and that calculates into about 22,000 acres. He got recalled to Netherlands, and then he became the head of a Swedish trading company, and came back to this area in 38. He again purchased land on the right bank from the natives and proclaimed New Sweden. He died in 1683 in St. Christopher Island in a storm. Jakob Leisler. He's a German-born colonist in the province of New York. He had a fur trade and tobacco business in New Amsterdam, or what we call today New York City. He was a militia captain. He seized control of the southern port of New Netherlands for about 2 years. He was a very strong Protestant. He revolted against the colonial authority of the Catholic English king because James II at that time was Catholic, and so the country also was Catholic. And Leisler's main grievance against King James was his trends toward ruling with absolute authority. And so Leisler got into a lot of trouble with the authorities. He was finally convicted of treason and was executed in New York City in 1691. Peter Fabian is rather bit of an unknown. He was a member of an expedition in 1663 to explore the Carolinas. They think he was a German mainly because in drawing the distances, and they think that he was the draftsman for this report on North Carolina, that all the distances were given in German miles and not in English miles. Now, at that particular time, that's not unusual in the sense that every country had its own weights and measures. It's hard to determine exactly how they related to one another. As far as I can determine that the German mile is roughly 2 to 3 English miles. So the original report of 1665 was signed in London by those 3 men. So that's where we get his name, and he's indicated to be the draftsman. The title page you see here is from an edition of the report in 1709. Now we have John Lederer. This is a very interesting character. Born in Hamburg, he was a medical physician, but also an explorer. And he came to Jamestown first in 1668 and somehow made contact with the governor of Virginia, who thought the wealth of Virginia would increase by finding a passage over the Allegheny Mountains to the Pacific. So I guess the dream of finding a way to the Pacific across the land still was alive in the mid-1600s. His first attempt, his was actually the first attempt to make an accurate map of this area. And he did this during 3 different expeditions between 69 and 70. In the first expedition, he made some fantasy claims, like there is a great desert in Central Carolina, and that caused a great deal of concern about his trustworthiness. In the second position, he had problems with a fellow explorer by the name of Harris, who had a like mind in the sense that he claimed that a wide lake-like passage created by the James River was a southern extension of the Lake of Canada. And finally, in his third expedition, he explored the upper James River and then the Roanoke, and finally found a way around the mountains in northern Georgia. He may have been a little fantastical, but evidently he was a good map maker. Here is the reproduction of his map. It's a little different, which we might expect from him. As you can see, north is the right side here. This is north, and this is south. And perhaps you can see the dotted lines, which indicate his exploration paths. And our last person is a man whose name was Hans. He was not with the English, but he was with the French. The French explorer La Salle was down in Mexico, and he wanted to find the Mississippi and go back north. And he was just lost. He was all the way over to Texas. And his men just got tired of going nowhere, so to speak, around in circles. And so one of the Frenchmen shot La Salle and killed him. And this disappointed, disappointed the German Hans very much. And a couple of days later, he shot Duhaut, who murdered La Salle. Eventually, the group went back to the French post, but Hans thought he would be punished for killing Duhaut, so he fled to join Indians, whom Hans had earlier helped to fight the hostile tribe. So that ends my presentation. We have time for some question and answers. We will now allow questions and answers to be exchanged. So you should use the Q&A that's available to you through the Zoom software, and send me a question. I will read the question out loud so everyone can hear it and then answer it. Thank you for your attention.
Alan, it looks like you do have some questions.
I'm looking through all the items. Let's see, I guess this is a question here. The question is from Margaret, and her question is, Alan, is your textbook available? Well, I would say maybe. I never did produce an actual textbook in print. I just created back at that time a CD with all the text files and an additional CD with some music and other types of sounds. So it's, if you're interested in the CD, I would be happy to share that with you.
And I can also read you some questions that I see.
Okay, I can't see any more.
Okay. Jim asked, did the Germans in the New World establish Lutheran churches in those early years?
All of the Germans were, not all of them were Catholic, but I would say there was a number of Catholic. It's really depends upon what time period you're talking about. The later ones in North America may have been mainly Lutheran or Reformed, but I think those in South America were for the most part Catholic. Is there
oh, I'm sorry.
Another question?
Yes. Edie asked, do we know of any German-speaking women who might have come, or were these men-only endeavors?
No, I'm sorry to say that I'm not aware of any women who came. I'm assuming that some did. In South America, most of these were men. They were mostly military companies. I don't know to what extent women may have participated in that. It's possible, but no records that I've come across have talked about any women. I would say the first women I know about were probably in the Concord voyage of 1683.
And then one other question from Joyce asked about Hans and wonders of the source of information about his going to live with natives.
I had to think about the sources for that. I've read over the years many books on this topic, and I'm not sure just what book I used or what book had that information. I'm sorry.
Well, that looks like all of the questions then. So thank you so much, Alan. I know other people have added comments saying excellent program and fascinating, and they thank you, as do we, for sharing this.
Great. Thank you for hosting.
Our next brown bag, by the way, will be not the second Wednesday, but the first Wednesday on February 2nd, as we explore what else? Groundhog Day. Thanks for joining us.